Welcome to Italian Innovators. I'm Luca Cottini, and today I'm in the company of Paolo Taticchi, Professor of Strategy and Sustainability and Deputy Director of MBA and Global Engagement at the University College of London School of Management. Paolo is a gifted teacher and an internationally recognized researcher in the fields of corporate sustainability, competitive advantage, performance measurement, business networks, and the future of cities. He held teaching appointments in business schools or MBA programs of 14 countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. He has authored over 50 academic journal articles, edited or co-authored several books, and is regularly invited to give keynote talks at academic, governmental, and industry conferences. Outside of the academy, he serves in the advisory board of influential international organizations, and he's the co-founder of 3 engineering and consulting firms. His work and projects have been consistently featured on international media outlets like the Financial Times, Forbes, The Telegraph, and CNN. In 2018, Paolo was chosen as one of Poets and Quant's top 40 business school professors under the age of 40 and was awarded the title of Knight of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic. In 2019, he received the Talented Young Italian Award from the Italian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the UK. And in 2021, the Italian's leading business daily Sole 24 Ore indicated him as the most influential Italian under the age of 40. So welcome, Paolo. It's really a great pleasure to have you in the show.
Thank you very much, Luca. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, at least virtually.
Thank you. So today we'll talk about the Italian influence, Italian models of sustainability, the future of cities and universities, and the Italian model of humanistic management. And I want to start from your story. Now, in your path from your studies in Perugia, Umbria, to your current position in London, it seems like your father has been a constant reference point and an influential figure for you and your work. What did you learn from him about the craft of teaching, and how did you get to your position at UCL, and why research plays such an important role in your teaching?
So that's a very good question. I guess when I look at my academic journey, I can probably recognize 3 people who genuinely influenced that journey. One is my father, and my father is a retired professor in chemistry. The second influencer is my PhD supervisor, who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. And the third influencer, the professor who hosted me at NYU Stern during my PhD. So kind of 3 academics that really, in a way, influenced my interests for the academic world and also mentored me in entering this type of career. Now, my father is probably definitely the first one who influenced this journey, and something that I probably recognize when I look at him as an academic is incredible passion for this work. I guess me and my father are very I've got a very different attitude to academia. My father, being a professor in chemistry, is kind of the classic stereotype of a scientist. While I always, been interested to management science and business science, but I have always had a great interest for consulting, advising organizations, so the kind of practical side of things. I guess my father was a role model for me in terms of, hard working culture and approach to kind of, to work. And that is, something you do need, in this type of work, because you never stop studying. And, there is always a new knowledge that you need to acquire in order to remain, a competitive, talented professor. So I believe also something that I acknowledge him is a view of academic careers as very international careers. So he spent time in the Nordics. He spent time in the US when he was a young scholar. And at the beginning of my journey, it really pushed me to have exposure to different academic environments. And that's probably why today I have this passion for teaching around the world. And I think I really hone him a lot in terms of his passion and approach to academia is something that has shaped my approach.
Definitely, and teaching and research are really a craft, and you understand this within kind of a relationship which becomes a workshop, really a bottega, as in the Italian tradition. And we discussed many stories of father-sons like Camillo and Adriano Olivetti, Leopoldo and Vittorio Alinari. I'll soon do an episode on Carlo and Ettore Bugatti, how Bugatti developed like a car company out of the work of his father, who was like an ebonist. He was a designer of furniture, but he learned the craft of doing something well. Yeah. So, and this is also the story, my story of the relationship with my father, who was also a teacher and a scholar. And so I recognize myself a lot in what you were saying. Now, from education to the business world and the social media influence, which is a term that we used earlier, plays really a big role in determining the visibility and the success also of a company. And as I try to illustrate also in the show, Italians are really trendsetters in a number of sectors. But what does Italian influence consist of, in your opinion? And what makes Italians influential in the global context?
This is a very interesting question. I guess there are a number of things that really related to our culture and way of living. I guess some when I look at Italians and think at Italians, something that comes to mind is that we are very social animals. We like to share things. We don't like to eat alone. We like to eat together with friends and family, and we like these large families. So I think there is a passion for sharing that most likely is a bit more than the average compared to other countries and cultures, and that is is something that is kind of in a way leading to this opportunity of becoming influencers, or at least to a necessary skill that influencers need to have, which is sharing what you want to share. I guess another aspect is our approach to things in terms of passion for innovation. I think many when they look at Italy, when they look at Italians, they kind of associate Italians to beauty, to innovation, and to a passion for these things. And this is again, I think when you are an influencer, you don't tend to share necessarily the best practice. You tend to share about innovative things or innovative thoughts. And I think we tend to have this approach in Italy. In fact, we are not, when I look at, for example, the business environment, in Italy, you are not going to find probably, the most talented, managers of Europe. Yes, there is plenty of, but I would say it's not, the best management school in Europe. But when you look at entrepreneurs in Italy, you're going to find incredible entrepreneurs because they are very creative, they are very innovative in what they do, and they have this passion for innovation. So again, I guess there is an innovation pillar that explains why many Italians are influencers. The third aspect, I guess, is education. I see a lot of Italians, leading and emerging in different environments around the world outside Italy. And I guess very often it's not only because they are talented professionals in what they do, but I guess they have a very broad education that allows them to understand complex environments and to find a place in these complex environments. And again, when you're able to find a place in a complex environment, there is a chance that you may be able to become an influencer. So I guess these are three things, a broad, strong education, an approach, based on innovation, and these, passion for sharing are three things that can explain why, Italians are often recognized, as you said, as influencers.
Definitely, there is also kind of a dialogic or relational attitude that is also intrinsically related to kind of the theatricality that you described of Italian life, also the centrality of melodrama in Italian life, which actually turns things into events that makes them relevant, because the ability of an influencer is the ability to create content out of daily interactions, out of daily objects that we use or things that we interact with. So certainly I agree very much with what you were saying.
And I think, if I can add,
definitely.
There is also kind of history that pushes us to become influencers, because we had so many influencers in the past. Starting from the Roman Empire, that I think we understand that becoming an influencer is an option. It's not impossible. It's actually an option, because we have so many models from the past of people who have influenced the world in different ways. That I think we recognize it as a possibility, and again that is probably rooted in our culture.
And also sometimes an urgency, a possibility, and sometimes also an urgency, in the sense that, like, in the history of Italian industrialism, Italy is kind of like comes late. So in this sense, the ability to create the industrial product as an aesthetic product, as an object that creates a trend, becomes a positioning, an urgency to kind of gain centrality in the market.
Absolutely.
Now, in our contemporary world, really, sustainability has become an important asset in the portfolio of a company.
Yeah.
What are some original models of sustainability in the Italian context? And can you make some examples of innovative approaches to sustainability?
Yeah, I think, today sustainability is a huge, topic in industry and in the agenda of policymakers. And I think there are, great examples in Italy of organizations that are, leading the way in this space. For me, something interesting is that when you look at, for example, research analyzing the connection between sustainability performance and types of governance, you find that very often family businesses tend to perform very well when it comes to sustainability, because they tend to conceive a business as something you try to build for the long term, and to pass it to the next generations. So this is I think is an interesting starting point for this discussion, because when you look at Italy, you're looking at a country where 98% of companies are basically small and medium enterprises, and in the large majority of cases, family businesses. So even if you look at some of the famous Italian brands, very often these organizations, even if now they are public, the companies, these organizations started as family businesses. So I think sustainability is very often really has been there since the very origin of these businesses. So I think today it's easy to identify a number of companies, as I said, that are leading the way. Organizations that come to mind, I guess, companies like Illy, for example, in the coffee industry. It's very interesting what they have been doing, for example, to address sustainability from many different perspectives. For example, the risks associated to climate change that is impacting agriculture in South America, countries where they source coffee, and the type of efforts they have made to help the local organizations in these countries to take climate action, and at the same time to sustain agriculture in these countries. Or for example, companies like Brunello Cucinelli that have built organizations focused on people, and introduced some very innovative, practices to really make sure that employees are valued within organizations, and that becomes, a driver of a competitive advantage. Or companies like Enel, for example. Enel is the Italian. I have to say now international, because they operate in a number of markets, but is an Italian leading energy provider, and they have developed a very interesting approach to sustainability, because they merge the sustainability with innovation. In research today, we speak about the sustainability-oriented innovation, to basically identify these approaches where companies innovate products, processes, business models driven by a desire of becoming more sustainable. And Enel has been a great example of that. I think they were probably the first organization in the world to actually have formally in the organizational chart someone with a job title of head of, they call it, if I remember well, innovability, because they merged the two words, sustainability and innovation. And I think that is a very interesting approach. So in Italy, you have quite a few stories, and again, very often associated to family businesses that have tried to build organizations with a sense of purpose, responsible organizations, organizations that create value for a plurality of stakeholders, like the local communities, and not only the shareholders. So it's quite, I'm very proud of some of the organizations we have in Italy.
Definitely, also sustainability applied to human, natural, and kind of industrial sustainability, which is conceived as a value creator and not just as a thing or an asset that you have to have in place for the success of your company. So as a positive outlook, as a forward-looking approach to sustainability.
Absolutely.
And now in the context of the pandemic, also sustainability applies to the university, and many, especially in the United States, question the sustainability of the university model itself. Now here in the US, tuition expenses really put a lot of pressure on both students and their families and scholars, especially in those fields that are considered less marketable. in general, universities, as they always have been, are really privileged institutions to think about the present, but most of all to imagine the future. But now with the digital transformation and the rapid changes to the market that the pandemic engendered, how will the university of the future look like, in your opinion? And as you also implied in an article that you wrote for Corriere della Sera in reference to children, why the investment on higher education remains a key asset?
Mm-hmm. So I guess the quick answer is, universities are going to be very different probably 10 years from now, because there is a huge level of disruption going on in our industry. And this is very interesting because there are industries that tend to change faster than others. And historically, our industry doesn't like changing. So we don't, until now, if you look at, what has been happening in the last 30 years, it's hard to recognize, honestly, major changes in our world, right? But I guess, this is the decade for change. And personally, I really recognize many trends that will destabilize the current business model of many universities. I guess you alluded to the issue of democratizing access to education, and the fact that accumulating $500,000 debt for studying is not sustainable anymore, and that is something that I'm sure will be a driver of disruption in higher education in the years coming, access and democratization. But there are, of course, other trends as well. You have, of course, online education. I guess online education was an emerging trend before the pandemic. Now we have been through the largest experiment of online education that has ever been done in the planet. Not that we wanted that experiment, but somehow we ended up playing with this experiment. And the reality is that online will change our industry, not because we are moving completely to online, but because traditional education will be blended. And there are other trends as well. You have I guess an interesting concept that is emerging with a focus on lifelong learning. So this idea that you go to university for 3 years, and that's basically the period where you develop your knowledge, and this is it for your life. Again, that type of approach, I think, is gone. I think it's very clear that we do need to continuously learn, and this means that there is an opportunity there for higher education institutions to become partners in lifelong learning, and some schools, I believe, are playing with this concept today. Another interesting, I guess, area of disruption will be focused on the purpose of higher education. At the end, every year we educate, graduate thousands and thousands of future leaders of business and society. And I think it's increasingly more important that values are integrated into education. I think it's increasingly more important that we educate the leaders that are able to drive a positive change in the direction of a sustainable development. So how higher education institutions will be able to respond to these questions and these areas of change, I think is a very interesting question. I think some higher education institutions will manage this change, but there are good probabilities that the traditional areas of our business will be disrupted, and maybe new providers that are not universities will address some of these challenges that I just mentioned. I think you referred to an article that was published in Corriere della Sera a number of months ago, and in that article I was speaking about the paramount importance of education, and I kind of know I'm a strong believer that we live in an increasingly complex world. I think today for young people to be competitive in this world, you do need to have a very strong demonstrable skills and a huge level of education. Otherwise, it's kind of tough to get jobs in the market, at least the good jobs. And with the impact of technologies and artificial intelligence, and robots, I guess the education needs of humans are going to be even higher. So I believe we do need to build the societies where education is at the core of everything we do. I'm a bit skeptic when I kind of read these interviews where there are well-known entrepreneurs saying that education is not needed. I think that's a very dangerous message that they send. It is, and it is true that we had in the past, for example, some incredibly successful business leaders that were not educated. But I guess if you kind of look at this statistically, you are going to find that the large majority of today's business leaders, for example, are extremely well educated.
And not just in economics, they have like a broad understanding of the world.
So I think we do need to pass this message to the young generations that education is key and education is for life. So very important concept.
No, and not just education as your CV, as in the English meaning of the word, or as in a product which is ultimately sold, like the degree in a university setting, but education as the ability to form kind of a human being that is capable of combining substance, depth, from a traditional heritage, a culture, with lightness and the ability to innovate and create new things. So this requires a lot of work. It doesn't happen from one day to another. It requires people who are fully human, fully trained, fully capable, but who have like a larger horizon of action. Now, within this horizon, I also wanted to touch upon like another of your topics, like related to the future of cities. And this is really interesting for me because like historically, Italians have been heavily involved in the planning of the urban landscapes. So from the Renaissance, really, the theorization of a new ideal city centered around the just proportion of elements and geometric harmony to, for example, in the 20th century, Calvino's imagination of the invisible cities, or from the experiments of like industrial cities like Ivrea or Solomeo built around the typewriter company Olivetti, and we mentioned earlier the fashion company Brunello Cucinelli, to the contemporary reflection, for example, on smart city, for example, of MIT professor Carlo Ratti. So what elements of the Italian urban tradition are important in defining the smart city of the 21st century, and what will the ideal city of the future will look like?
I'm gonna start from this last question. I guess the ideal city will be built around the citizens. I think that is not a given. By the way, I'm involved in a number of smart city projects and initiatives around the world, and I'm very often invited to attend, for example, innovation challenges where there are, startups and entrepreneurs pitching ideas that have the potential to kind of transform cities and make them smarter. And at times I have this feeling, and that's very often when I challenge these entrepreneurs that yes, from a technology application perspective, a super cool idea.
Mhm.
But is this actually going to improve the life of people living in this city? Is this actually designed to help citizens? I'm not that sure. So I think a key challenge that I recognize today in this kind of space of smart cities is how we humanize innovation. So how we make sure that the way we design cities, how we make sure that the way we use technology, how we make sure that the way we design the policies is actually focused on citizens, okay? So citizens should be at the core of every kind of smart city design. When you look at mobility, when you look at creating economies in cities, when you look at providing government services. And very often, if you look at the market research approaches of organizations or the design approaches when it comes to addressing some of the classic problems faced by cities, you realize that the citizens are not analyzed and listened at all. So for me, the ideal city is really built around the citizens, and that is very important. I guess when it comes to designing, the future cities, there are a number of perspectives to keep in mind on the top of this focus on citizens. And it is my opinion that these perspectives include sustainability in terms of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. These perspectives include stakeholders because cities are very complex environments. We often speak about the cities, but the reality is that when you look inside the city, each neighbor, differs from the other one. So you can't have generic smart city initiatives. So, you
Mhm.
probably needed to go down to the level of communities and neighborhoods to make things work. So identifying stakeholders and listening stakeholders, engaging the stakeholders, that's vital. The third perspective I think is very important is the system thinking. Very often today, city leaders and government organizations are organized in silos. So you have people looking at mobility problems, people are looking at energy issues, people are looking at I don't know, buildings, and these organizations and people don't talk each other. So the risk is that you optimize subsystems, but at times the solutions that optimize a subsystem create trouble for another subsystem of the city. So if you don't have a system thinking approach to cities, the risk is that you go in the wrong direction. So these, I guess, are useful perspectives to design future cities. Now, what you can learn from Italy, I think you described a very good picture. When you look at some of the influencers of the past, you're going to recognize that many of them at a certain point have touched on cities. Probably because we live in cities, and doesn't matter if you are an architect or a businessman or an artist. At some point, city life is touching you. So this is why famous innovators like Leonardo da Vinci at a certain point started producing drawings trying to imagine the cities of the future. And they basically, identified the concepts that are still very actual. I think, Leonardo da Vinci, to pick one, was speaking, was, for example, referring to this concept of layers. and he was suggesting this idea of building kind of cities vertically with different layers for different purposes. So, for example, this idea that citizens during their social time should not mix up, for example, with transportation systems aimed at moving goods. Different transportation systems for different purposes organized in different layers in a city. Now that is is an interesting concept because today when we look at the design of modern smart cities, we tend to very often refer to layers. And today, for example, we are adding layers associated with technology. We are adding layers associated to data. So I think this is a concept that is coming from the past. That was mentioned many centuries ago from innovators like Leonardo da Vinci that had a very good vision of cities. Something that I think is inspiring from the Italian culture is I think the passion and the importance of squares. So when you go in kind of small villages and small cities in Italy, you realize that these cities and villages are really built around the squares, and that's where basically kind of people meet and socialize and kind of network and kind of do business and on all these type of things. Now, I guess having modern cities with spaces for social life is extremely important, and something that we could try to copy from the Italian model. I'm always fascinated by, for example, the tradition of Italian markets that is not just about the selling goods, is about meeting people, is about going there in the morning or going there during the weekend to meet people, not necessarily because you buy things. So I guess spaces for socialization are going to be very important in modern cities, where life very often is very problematic.
No, definitely. Also, the Italian model of the city as a web of meaningful interactions, of stories, Calvino would say, a network, a patchwork of stories that live together. And this might be an interesting antidote against kind of the pure technological application of the Internet of Things to the development of the city. And also, it might be an interesting prompt to creating kind of agile teams from the digital world to the kind of piazzas where different competencies and skills work together and not separately in silos. So certainly the Italian space has a lot to say about this creation of a web of meaningful interactions among the citizens, but also with the environment. Now, in the Italian context, there are, as we discussed earlier, many entrepreneurs, leaders, or CEOs that have a background in the humanities. We mentioned earlier Brunello Cucinelli, but to add a few examples, Sergio Marchionne, the CEO of Fiat, has had a bachelor degree in philosophy. Laura Biagiotti, a fashion entrepreneur, studied archaeology in Rome. The director of CERN, physicist Fabiola Gianotti, has a piano degree. And Italy's richest man, Giovanni Ferrero, owner of the confectionery company, is actually a best-selling novelist. So why is the humanistic background a resource for managers? And why is this rootedness in the arts a key component in the success of Italian industry?
I think, key for success in any kind of business is diversity of thinking. I guess someone with a humanistic type of education approaches business in a very different way from someone with a degree in economics or a degree in engineering. And I guess this approach can naturally lead to different type of business models, different types of governance, different types of leadership that can make these organizations, extremely competitive. So I don't, necessarily believe that a background of this kind is, leading to a superior competitive advantage. But I strongly believe that it can be a source of competitive advantage because it basically brings a completely different perspective on, business problems and business solutions. And diversity is a valuable asset in strategic and entrepreneurial thinking. So for me, it's no surprise that these entrepreneurs you mentioned have been able to develop very successful organizations. I think is a very powerful background they have, and the reality is that for being a good entrepreneur, there is no preferential background. I think it's more about skills, an open mind, the ability to to see opportunities in things. The ability to innovate, what you do or the existing way of doing things, being a creative when it comes to identifying solutions to problems. Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you have leaders with very different backgrounds.
Oh, definitely. And one last question, were you to point to an Italian company that, in your opinion, represents a particular way to innovation, which one would you pick and why?
I think a company I admire is actually a company I mentioned before, Enel, because it's a company that has been able to demonstrate the ability to innovate in a relatively traditional sector and in a context where other competitors have not demonstrated the same ability. So I think innovation was challenging in that environment, and they basically have demonstrated very interesting approaches to business. So they didn't try to simply innovate products or services or innovate the organization or innovate the company in terms of people or organization. They basically went. I think they at a certain point they truly put in discussion the pillars of the business model, and started breaking these pillars. So today is an organization that is completely different from 20 years ago in terms of the type of businesses they are in terms of the organization that they have for innovation, in terms of leadership structure, and this type of change, to be honest, is not easy. And I think they demonstrated an exceptional ability to change. So this is probably one of the reasons why I like them.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation. It was really kind of a 360 overview of the contemporary situation.
We touched on many things, right?
Yeah. Definitely, we talked about management and sustainability from an Italian and global perspective. We discussed how the Italian humanistic wave to economic growth can model new paths of urban development, knowledge design, and also ethical entrepreneurship. So thank you very much for being with us today. It was a real pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you very much for having me.
And thanks for listening. I invite you to subscribe to this channel or to this newsletter on the webpage of the show at www.italianinnovators.com to receive notifications of new episodes and know more about this project. You can also follow me on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for updates, news, and additional materials. Thanks again for your support. Arrivederci e alla prossima.